As many of you pointed out in this week's discussion, one of the social myths in our society about sexual violence is that only women and girls can be victims of sexual violence. Men, women, boys, girls, and those beyond the binary can all be victims of sexual violence. In fact, the CDC has suggested that approximately 1 in 4 men in the United States has been the victim of contact sexual violence. Contact sexual violence includes being raped or penetrated, but it can also include being forced to penetrate someone else or being coerced into a sexual activity or unwanted sexual contact. In fact, the CDC also reports that approximately 1 in 38 men in the United States state that they have been forced to penetrate another person, and approximately 1 in 38 men in the US have been the victim of attempted or completed rape. In this mini lecture, we'll talk more about male sexual victimization and how it plays out within two specific contexts: prison systems as well as within the context of war and conflict. We'll also talk about sexual violence as a cultural practice. In one of your assigned readings for this week, Male Sexual Victimization, Examining Men's Experiences of Rape and Sexual Assault by Karen Weiss, the author uses data from the National Crime Victimization Survey in conducting her research. This data is important as it provides us with a number of trends related to sexual violence against men and boys, and I think it's worth taking an extra moment to look in depth at a few points from this data set. The first thing I'd like to bring your attention to is related to the biological sex of the offender. Amongst the men that participated in this survey, 54.3% stated that the offender was male. However, 45.7% stated that the offender or perpetrator was female. This shatters the myth that the vast majority of sex offenders are male. As you can see, amongst men that participated in this survey, it was almost 50-50. Another point I'd like to bring your attention to is related to the age of the victim at the time of the incident. In this study, the men who participated were 25 and older, 49.4% of the time. In other words, the vast majority of men that participated in the survey stated that at the time of the incident, they were already an adult. This really speaks to the assumption that many people have in our society that it's young boys and adolescents who are victims of sexual violence, as opposed to adult men. Of course, there are limitations to all data sets, and the National Crime Victimization Survey data is no exception. One thing to note is that while the total number of participants in this survey was over 1,000, the number of male participants was only 94. It's also important to note that the National Crime Victimization Survey is done every 10 to 20 years. And therefore, the data that is reflected in this database comes from a survey that was conducted between 1992 and 2000. Thus, it's important for us to consider whether or not there may be changes as we've progressed in terms of talking about sexual violence, especially male sexual victimization. When male sexual victimization is discussed, it's often within the context of prison systems or, more recently, within the context of war or conflict. Prison rape is simply defined as the unwanted sexual contact experienced by men and women who are incarcerated. It's hard to get accurate data on the extent of rape in prisons because inmates fear reporting the assault. There's shame and stigma connected to being sexually victimized, and there is fear that if it's known that they were victims, it will put them at risk for future assaults. In 2010, the Department of Justice estimated approximately 88,500 inmates, or 4.4% of individuals in prison and 3.1% of those in jail, were victims of prison rape in the previous year. It's assumed that these are underestimates, as we know that rape is one of the most underreported crimes, broadly speaking. And as we just mentioned, within the context of prison, this is especially true given that victims are likely to face retaliation from prison officials or other inmates when they report instances of abuse. Research has also found that prison culture impacts how prisoners define what is sex and what is violence. And this can explain a number of the variations in rates of prison rape found in various data sets. There's a long history of research on sexual violence during times of conflict and wartime rape. Research shows that sexual violence against women escalates during wartime. However, men are also raped during wartime as a form of gender based violence, and the goal is often psychological humiliation. This is particularly harsh within areas where homosexuality is highly stigmatized. The United Nations outlines 4 different types of war rape, and 3 of them are applicable to situations when men and boys are victims of sexual violence. Genocidal rape is often seen in instances of ethnic cleansing, such as in Rwanda or the Balkans, when the main goal is to destroy an ethnic or political group. In these cases, the psychological goal of humiliation is key. Men and boys also experience rape and sexual violence when opportunistic rape occurs in conflict areas. This is when the perpetrator takes advantage of the chaos of wartime to inflict sexual violence because they know they will most likely not face any kind of political or criminal prosecution. And finally, political rape occurs when an individual is punished for not having the same political views as their perpetrator or oppressor. There are also cultural practices that involve sexual interactions but don't necessarily involve consent. We often think of these practices impacting girls, such as the case of child brides. But there are also practices that impact young boys and adolescent boys. Now, as a trigger warning, the practice I want to share with you might seem extremely disturbing because it involves taboos related to sex, sexual interactions, consent, and age. The Sambia are a mountain tribe who live in Papua New Guinea. And for generations, the Sambia were warring people, and they valued strong, brave, and, for lack of a better word, masculine men. The Sambia believed that for boys to embody these traits, they needed to go through a ritual training as a means of moving from boyhood into full adult manhood. Sambia boys from age about 7 to 10 begin these rituals by being removed from their family huts. Prior to the ritual, children, both boys and girls, primarily live within the care of their mothers and other female relatives. But at age 7 to 10, boys are separated from these female relatives and taken to engage in an initiation process, which includes beatings, piercings, and various challenges of strength and endurance. In addition, the boys must perform fellatio on older adolescent boys and young men so that the boys can receive the vital life fluid, which is semen, from an older man and thus become strong, brave, and masculine men themselves. In the 1970s, anthropologist Gil Hurt studied the Sambia, and one of the participants that he interviews said if a boy doesn't eat semen, he'll remain small and weak. The tribe firmly believes that semen is a source of life and essential for masculinity. Now, while women and younger children are not necessarily privy to the practices of male initiation, it's not because they feel that the practice of boy insemination is taboo or a form of sexual violence. Rather, it's because women and young children still attached to their mothers and female relatives are polluting and can therefore reduce masculinity. Now, just as a side note, the Zambia actually do not have any concepts within their society of being homosexual or gay, and they don't recognize that two men or two women could culturally be recognized as sexual partners. The practice of performing fellatio is only done as a means of helping boys transition into manhood. Once a boy has reached a certain age, he would no longer perform fellatio, although he might be the one that fellatio is performed upon.